Okay.
All right, so Major League Baseball has reinstated Pete Rose. Commissioner Rob Manfred announced yesterday the all-time hits leader has been posthumously removed from the league's permanently ineligible list, paving the way for his potential election to the Hall of Fame. In a letter written by Manfred and sent to the Rose family's attorney, Manfred writes this: "In my view, once an individual has passed away, the purposes of Rule 21 have been served." Manfred was referring to the MLB rule prohibiting gambling and other misconduct that threatens the integrity of the game, which led to Rose's decades-long ban. The rule does not address what happens after a banned individual dies, leaving the door open to Manfred's interpretation. The decision also applies to 16 others, including Shoeless Joe Jackson and his 1919 so-called Chicago Black Sox teammates who threw the World Series that year. Joining us now, senior MLB writer for The Athletic, Jayson Stark, and MSNBC contributor, Mike Barnicle. Good to see you both up. So, Jayson, what's your read on what prompted this move from Commissioner Manfred?
Willie, I think it's certainly possible to connect the dots between the commissioner's meeting with Donald Trump a few weeks ago and this decision. Before that meeting, there had never been any indication that Rob Manfred was open to reinstating Pete Rose or any of these other men. And things changed rapidly. So is it possible to connect those dots? I think it is.
Yeah, so I'm curious why. So you think it may be the meeting with Donald Trump? I'm curious what your thought is, just in general, about what's your position been about Pete Rose? Because mine is completely different than it is for some of the guys, whether it's Sosa, McGuire, whose numbers were artificially elevated in a way that Bonds and Clemens, they were great even before the steroids era and probably should get in. But I never quite understood Rose being kept out after all those years. What was your view?
Well, Joe, like all the members of the baseball writers, I've never had a chance to vote on Pete Rose, but it's been interesting to watch the evolution of what we think about gambling in baseball, gambling in sports through the years. When Bart Giamatti announced this ban in 1989, this was viewed as the cardinal sin of baseball. And within the sport, it still is. You cannot bet on baseball if you work in baseball. And yet, you walk into ballparks now and you can bet on the game you're going to watch right there at the ballpark. And so it's blurring the lines between how great a sin this actually is now in the eyes of many people. But when it comes to whether Pete Rose is going to get into the Hall of Fame, his fate is now in the hands of a committee. This committee will be made up of Hall of Fame players, executives, and members of the media. And their opinions don't have to mirror what the public's opinions are. They know everything about Pete Rose. But I just wrote a column that's in The Athletic as we speak that says, by doing this, Rob Manfred is essentially telling us Pete Rose has served his time. And Joe, if he served his time, doesn't that mean we should be voting on him as Pete Rose, the baseball player? And Pete Rose, the guy who got more hits than anybody who ever lived, that would seem like a Hall of Fame player.
Yeah. So, Mike Barnicle, you've long said put Pete Rose in the Hall of Fame and put it on the plaque. Explain what he did alongside all of his accomplishments on the baseball field, which were many, of course, including being the all-time hits king. You know the commissioner well. You're very plugged into Major League Baseball. What's your sense of how this all came about?
It remains the same. Pete Rose, Shoeless Joe Jackson, a bunch of others, Bonds, Clemens. Put them out on the Hall of Fame. They're Hall of Fame baseball players, and put it on the plaque. Put the allegations on the plaque. Put Pete Rose's entire career on the plaque. Jayson raised a really critical point, though. In baseball, in every clubhouse, in every Major League Baseball clubhouse, there is a sign about gambling. If you gamble, you're dead. You're out of the game. It's right there. You can read it when you go in the clubhouse, any clubhouse. And yet you can go sit and watch a ball game and have someone sitting in front of you or behind you betting on at-bats as the game takes place in front of us, and you watch the commercials on TV, baseball games, the gambling institutions have provided so much money, advertising money, to Major League Baseball that it's kind of hypocritical to sit there and say, oh, no, he gambled, he can't be in the Hall of Fame. And yet you're taking all of this money from these gambling institutions. It's incredible.
Interesting.
Yeah. I mean, given all that, I mean, and Rose was such and I guess because I grew up watching Pete Rose, never liked him as a player. I was a Braves fan, never liked his attitude, he was rough. To say he was rough around the edges is an understatement. He belongs in the Hall of Fame, Mike, doesn't he? He was extraordinary, an extraordinary player in every way.
You know, I was talking with someone yesterday about Pete Rose, and he does have that reputation, and that image is lasting. An angry guy, practically illiterate, always angry, hard to get along with. But I distinctly remember the night after Game 6 of the 1975 World Series, the afternoon after that game, approaching Pete Rose, who was on the field at Fenway working out. It was about 3 or 4 hours before Game 7. Unfortunately, the Red Sox lost Game 7. Approaching Pete Rose to ask him a question about playing in a game like that. And I was kind of, anxious about was he going to tell me to, screw whatever? And I went up to him and I said, Pete, let me ask you something. What do you think? What happens to a player the day after a game that you played like last night? And he paused for a few seconds and looked right at me and said, he said it was an honor to play in a game like that. That was one of the greatest games I've ever participated in. And I was shocked.
Wow. That is.
I mean, that's straight
enlightening.
Love of the game right there.
So, Jason, it sounds like you're open to the idea now of voting for Pete Rose. I don't want to put you on the spot in this moment unless you want to announce your vote for the Hall of Fame. But what do you think about the other writers, your colleagues, the guys you've kind of grown up in the business and worked alongside for so long? What's their attitude about Pete Rose? And do you think this decision by the commissioner changes it?
Well, Willie, Pete Rose is never going to appear on the baseball writers ballot. His time, his eligibility for that is over. So he will only appear on a ballot, as I said, that's considered by one of these committees. And there will be a lot of living Hall of Famers in the room. And, my sense is they're divided about this, just as people have been divided about it for 3 decades. But again, are they willing to look at what Rob Manfred did yesterday and come to the same conclusion that I came to? That if he served his time, we should be thinking about Pete Rose, the baseball player, and that's that. That means you have to overlook a lot of stuff. There are a lot of clouds that come with Pete and his candidacy and everything about him. But it's interesting to contemplate what would happen if those voters come to the same conclusion that I came to and elect Pete Rose. Mike mentioned Barry Bonds, Roger Clemens. I'm glad he mentioned them because once you open the door and Pete Rose bursts through and walks into Cooperstown, don't you think Bonds and Clemens and that whole group will be knocking on that door? It was very easy to keep them out when the guy who had the most hits in history was not in the Hall of Fame. If he's in, who knows who's next?
It'll be interesting to see where they come down on this. Let's talk about